that. The title of this message is The In-Between Time. And I think you'll figure out what that means as we go on here. In the last 18 months, if I have heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times, Jesus must be coming very soon. Because there's another word that if I've heard it once, I've heard it 10,000 times. It's the word unprecedented. We are experiencing an unprecedented global pandemic, unprecedented weather, unprecedented catastrophes, unprecedented racial tension, unprecedented political disunity and strife, etc. In the last 18 months, many of the things we all thought were nailed down have come loose. Things we thought would never happen are happening, and some of them are happening with an astonishing degree of frequency. And these things have forced us to face something that maybe some of us have never had to face before. An acute sense of our own vulnerability. A realization that bad things can happen that are beyond our control and that no amount of preparation or precaution can prevent. For Christians who believe in a God who is ultimately going to make things new and make things right, who is ultimately going to eradicate evil and pain and suffering. This present turmoil naturally leads us to wonder about his intervention, especially because the Bible predicts that just prior to Jesus' second coming, things in the world will go from bad to worse. And so when we see and experience deterioration and devastation like we have in the past few months, we surmise that his coming must be very near. That is natural. It's appropriate. But is it true? First of all, I'd like to say that it might be true. Jesus might be coming very soon. He could come at any time. But I hasten to add that Christians have been feeling this way and wondering these things since Jesus ascended into heaven 2,000 years ago. The apostles wondered it. And I think every thoughtful believer in every generation since has wondered it. Jesus knew that this would be on our minds. And so he addressed this subject in a lengthy discourse given to his disciples just a couple of days before he died on the cross. During the week leading up to Passover, when Jerusalem was full of pilgrims from around the world, Jesus had been going to the temple each day where he taught, performed miracles, interacted with the leaders of Judaism. On Wednesday, Jesus left the temple for the very last time and went to the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, with his disciples, presumably on his way back to Martha and Mary's house where we think he was staying. While ascending the Mount of Olives with Jerusalem in full view, in response to some questions the disciples asked about what was going to happen in the future, Jesus sat down and delivered an address that we now call the Olivet Discourse. Look at verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Jesus privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" You should know that in the Old Testament, descriptions of the end of the age were often associated with wars, cosmic battles, famines, earthquakes, and other catastrophic events. You may recall that Jesus had just finished telling his disciples that the temple in Jerusalem would be completely and utterly destroyed. In their minds, the most terrible, traumatic event that could ever happen was the destruction of the temple. And so, this is probably why they asked these two questions. When will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? For them, these events were boom, boom, boom. They were inseparable. Now, remember, the disciples still did not completely understand Jesus' predictions about his death and resurrection. They didn't know what to make of that. They certainly would not have understood the concept of Jesus' glorious second coming at this time. And so it is likely that they assumed the temple would be destroyed very, very soon, and that Jesus would then begin his messianic reign in Jerusalem shortly thereafter. Perhaps they were wondering if the trauma of the temple's destruction would cause the Jews to unify around Jesus as their Messiah, as their deliverer and king. In the following passages, which include all of chapters 24 and 25, Jesus responds to their questions and gives them and us some clues about how these future events will unfold. But trust me, they will unfold in a way that was very different than what the disciples expected. In this first part of the passage, the part we're going to be looking at this morning, Jesus gives a preview of the general conditions on earth that will characterize the entire period of time before his coming. We are currently living in this age. I call it the in-between age. And thus far, it's been going on for more than 2,000 years. Look at verse 4. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." Even before Jesus came to this earth, many self-proclaimed messiahs had asserted themselves into the Jewish consciousness, attempting to incite revolution against the occupying forces in Israel. Jesus warns that this will continue even after he's gone, and that some of these false messiahs will be very, very convincing. Thus, Jesus gives a stern admonition. See to it that no one leads you astray. which suggests that some of these imposters will be so persuasive that even Jesus' own followers will be vulnerable to believing their claims and following their lead. Therefore, Jesus says, you must be vigilant. You must be discerning. You must not be gullible. You must not allow yourself to be duped or tricked or easily taken in by these shysters. And what is so disturbing about Jesus' prediction here is that he says many will be led astray by these false messiahs. And included in the many, as we shall see later in the passage, are people who are professing Christians, people who right now claim to be followers of Christ. So here's a question for you. It's a natural question, but it's something we all should answer. Can you distinguish between the true Messiah, Jesus, and false messiahs? Or can you be duped? Look, nobody likes to think of themselves as gullible. Very few people would admit to being dupable. Oh, we can clearly see this trait in other people, and we can criticize them for it. But we tend to think of ourselves as informed and discerning, and therefore impervious to deception. I would never believe a false truth. I would never fall for a false prophet or follow a false Messiah. And yet gullibility is a common human trait. Even in the most informed, sophisticated culture that has ever existed, our culture, gullibility is rampant. There is an extremely alarming high percentage of people who currently believe false narratives, conspiracy theories, who swallow information hook, line, and sinker that is not true. And many are professing Christians who think they are immune to such things. But here's something else, and this is important to realize. It is very difficult to convince people who have been misled that they've been misled. Once they've been misled, they're convinced that what they believe is right. And you cannot convince them otherwise, no matter how sound and reasonable your arguments. In fact, they accuse you of being misled because you don't agree with them. Which is why we need to take Jesus' warning seriously. We can be misled more easily than we realize. And when we are misled, we are in danger of becoming entrenched in that deception and quite possibly falling away. He's going to talk about this later in this passage. Look now at verse 6. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Since the Old Testament and other popular Jewish writings at this time predicted that wars would precede the end of the age, it's natural, even now, for Christ followers to wonder if Jesus' return is imminent every time we hear about a war. But Jesus tells us and his disciples that wars and rumors of wars will be the norm in this in-between time. The time between Christ's first coming and second coming, the time in which we are now living. And so he's telling them not to be alarmed when they hear about wars. And why might Christians be alarmed? Because wars seem to contradict the notion that God is in control and that his kingdom is advancing and that his work is progressing. They seem to suggest that human governments, not God, are controlling the fate and destiny of this earth realm. But that's not true. Wars will be prevalent during this in-between time. But Christ followers can rest assured knowing that God is in control and that his purposes are indeed progressing according to his perfect plan. Again, more about that later. Look at the middle of verse 7. And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. I'm pretty sure that this reference to famines and earthquakes typifies all kinds of natural disasters, including floods, fires, tsunamis, volcanoes. Jesus is simply making the point that cataclysmic events like these often produce fear and make people wonder if the end is near. But he says, these kinds of things will be the norm during this in-between period of his first and second coming. And they shouldn't alarm us. They shouldn't make us necessarily conclude that Jesus' coming is right away. It might be, but it might not be. Because Jesus says that all of these things are but the beginning of the birth pains. Every one of you mothers who has had children wishes that your child would have come after the first contraction. But you knew going into it that there would be many more. And the metaphor that Jesus uses here highlights simply the fact that an expectant mother has to endure multiple contractions, and that she can't predict and no one else can predict just how many there will be before the baby finally comes. It may come on the 5th or the 15th or the 50th or the 500th. In the same way, wars, earthquakes, famines, and other catastrophes wash over the landscape of this in-between time with repeated painful occurrences. And each one reminds us that the end is coming, but no one knows when until the Son of Man shows up. So be patient, says Jesus, and persevere during this time. Many bad things are going to happen in this in-between age, even big bad things like the the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But these things are only the beginning of the birth pangs. And they will continue to occur throughout the entire age. Well, Jesus goes on in the next several verses to shift his focus from the suffering the world will experience in this in-between age to the suffering that his people, his followers, will experience during this same period. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. A mandatory course at the Christian university I attended was called Biblical Foundations, and a portion of that course was devoted to teaching students how to present the gospel to unbelievers. One of the course requirements was that we had to do a certain number of hours of door-to-door evangelism. Probably my least favorite assignment in my whole college career. I'm not sure who came up with the idea of door-to-door evangelism. I'd like to give them a piece of my mind. But I'm pretty sure that it was modeled after a concept that was very popular and pretty successful in those days, door-to-door sales. The concept of door-to-door sales is that a salesperson pitches a product to a customer that he says will make his or her life better, easier, more productive, more comfortable, more enjoyable. And so that was essentially the same pitch we were taught to give with our evangelism. God has a wonderful plan for your life. If you follow Jesus, you will get this, this, and this. Let me ask you, can you imagine Jesus doing door-to-door evangelism? God loves you and has a very painful plan for your life. You're going to be persecuted, hated, and you might even be killed. Come, follow me. Wow. But that's exactly what he says. Jesus forecasts for his followers during this time between his first and second coming a lot of trouble, a lot of distress. Not exactly your best life now, like somebody else said. Jesus said, they will deliver you up to tribulation. And inherent in the meaning of that word is the idea of intense pain and suffering. The they in this passage refers to people in authority. And deliver you up is a reference to a formal, official process. In other words, Jesus is describing here state-sponsored persecution. And this persecution, he says, may be so intense, well, it's going to be so intense that some of his followers would be killed. Christ followers will also be the objects of hatred. And this is not from just a few random individuals, but by all nations. In other words, this will be a universal hatred that emanates from every nation or people group on the planet. Now, Jesus had already warned his disciples about this. And when he did, he gave them the exact same reason why it would happen. It is on account of Jesus' name. It is because of their association with Jesus. It's because they bear the name Christian or Christ follower. Now, why would that produce hatred? That's a subject we could spend a lot of time on, but Jesus put it very simply in a conversation he had with Nicodemus in John 3, where he said, "And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world." That's him. The light has come into the world. "And people loved the darkness rather than the light." Why? Because their works were evil. "For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come into the light, lest his works should be exposed." Why? Because it brings shame, discomfort, guilt, things that people don't want to feel about themselves. So they try to snuff it out. You know, it is not easy being the objects of hatred and the targets of persecution. But this is the cost of discipleship. And Jesus is telling us this so that we can be prepared for it. And just so that we're clear, this is not persecution or hatred because of our political views or because we have convictions about social issues like I don't want to wear a mask or I'm an anti-vaxxer or something like that. That's not what he's talking about here, although I've heard people make the connection between those things. Listen, this is purely because of one's identification with Christ. We have his values. We display his character. We express his truth. It's about our relationship with Jesus. And it's those things that get us into trouble because, not just because people disagree with us, it's because it makes them squirm. Jesus is the light. We are the light. And people love darkness. Well, Jesus goes on to tell us that not everyone who professes to be a Christian is going to endure this persecution and suffering. Look at verse 10. "And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another." You know, this may be the most distressing prediction yet. During the time between Jesus' first and second coming, because of an unwillingness to endure persecution, many who profess to follow Jesus will fall away from the faith. Matthew uses a word here that's one of his favorite words. He's used it several times already, scandalizo. And here in the passive voice, it means to be caused to stumble or to be tripped by something or someone. It is a metaphor, but it describes a person who becomes spiritually disoriented so that he or she can no longer walk a straight line. They fall out of step or out of line. And in this context here, it refers to a professing Christian falling away from the faith. You may remember earlier when we were studying Matthew 13 that when Jesus told the parable of the soils, he described the seed that was sown on rocky ground, which quickly withered. When he explained the meaning of the parable to his disciples, he said, "As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word, immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away." By the way, same word, scandalizo. And as if this isn't tragic enough, these ones who have fallen away from the faith in order to save their own skin will turn on other Christ followers and betray them. Literally, deliver them up. It's the same word as in verse 9. And the idea here is that these former followers of Jesus become whistleblowers and rat out their former friends who are still following Jesus, so that those true believers are further harassed and persecuted. But that's not all. They don't just betray their former friends, they actively hate them. And by the way, Jim Krieg, our resident Greek scholar, told me after the first service that this is intended to be, how do I say, it's intended to be accentuated, or this is intense hatred, is what he was saying. They now feel disdain and animosity toward their former friends, which proves that they never really belonged to Jesus in the first place. How do I know that? We're going to talk about this more next week, by the way, Lord willing. Jesus said that the identifying mark, the defining characteristic of a child of God is love. And that every true Christian loves their brother and sister in Christ. Listen to what the Apostle John said. He said, "We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers." That's how you know you've been saved. But listen to this. Whoever does not love abides in death. In other words, they've never passed into life. They stay dead. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. Once again, Jesus is painting a picture about what the world will be like and about what it will be like for Christ followers during the time between his first and second coming, the in-between time. And it is not a pretty picture. It's dark. It's bleak. It's full of pain and suffering and heartache. What strikes me most about these predictions is that Jesus knew in advance that all of this was going to happen. He knew that between the time of his ascension into heaven and his second coming, that things on earth would go from bad to worse. And he knew that this would happen even though he died on a cross and rose from the dead to defeat the enemies of sin, Satan, and death our ultimate enemies. And yet he knew that even after defeating those enemies, the world would continue to be rife with deception, deterioration, and devastation. That sin's destructive forces would continue to wreak havoc, causing enormous pain and suffering, which it has. This is after his death and resurrection. This is after his ascension into heaven, where he sat down at the right hand of God. That's a place of sovereignty, isn't it? So I'm saying all of this to you because we hear these predictions, we see what's going on ourselves, and it sure doesn't seem like victory over sin, does it? It sure doesn't seem like Satan has been defeated, even death. It seems like those things are getting the upper hand. And we read here that Jesus knew they would. I want to submit to you, this is all part of Jesus' plan. This is all part of the upside down kingdom that we've been studying about in the book of Matthew. It may seem otherwise, but even with all the evil that has occurred and is continuing to occur in this age, Jesus is on the move. Slowly at times, inconspicuously at times, but he is steadily advancing. He is steadily accomplishing his purpose through the proclamation of truth, the gospel. He is actively and mightily at work during this time between his first and second coming. It's not always visible to us, and I don't think any of us knows the extent to which he is working. But for the one who accurately predicted the widespread deception and devastation that would be occurring right now in this age, we can trust that what he says will happen at the end will happen. And that is, he will have his way. Righteousness and truth will ultimately triumph. Jesus will reign in unrivaled majesty and splendor and glory. Sin and evil will be completely eradicated. And when that time comes, as it surely will, Jesus, we are told by the prophet Isaiah, will be able to look back at all of this pain and suffering and see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. We sang about that in the last verse of This Is My Father's World. All right, next week, Lord willing, I'm going to be presenting part 2 of this message entitled The In-Between Time. Jesus, as you'll find out, is going to predict a few more distressing things. By the way, it's been bad news completely today. I realize that. The good news is coming because next week there's a couple of promises that we're going to focus on. One is this: the one who endures to the end will be saved. And we're going to explore that for a while. We're also going to look at this promise: the gospel will be preached to all nations. I believe that's why we're in the in-between time, by the way. It's to give as many people an opportunity to respond to the gospel. And so, even as persecution and hostility intensify, and as global conditions seem to deteriorate, the church is on the move. How do I know that? Jesus said in Matthew 16, remember this? I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He's going to do what he's going to do. Look, I told you at the very beginning that in the last 18 months, if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times, Jesus must be coming very soon. And I told you that I think I'm hearing that because of our perception that we are living in a time when so many things are unprecedented. Can I be honest? Unprecedented things have happened in every generation. Every generation. Think of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Unprecedented. Think of the murder of all of the apostles. Now, how could that happen? Think of the fall of Rome. Think of the Crusades, the Black Plague, the Civil War, World Wars I and II. I'm not sure things are as bad today as what some of our brothers and sisters in previous generations have had to endure. Having said that, I think Jesus could come at any time, and I hope he does. But I can say for sure he is coming. And he wants us to live each and every day in preparation for his return. By the way, we talked about this as elders not too long ago. Our job as leaders in this church is to prepare you to see Jesus. If you want to boil it down, that's it. We're preparing you to see Jesus and be ready to meet him. Because that's what our lives are all about.